acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV Online Heaven Sword expansion. Take it away.
Alrighty. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is LordFluffy, as you heard, and this is the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV with free trial that includes all but Reborn and the award-winning Stormblood and Heaven Sword expansion. There's no restrictions on playtime. That means you can get up to level 70 and 3 expansion worth of content for absolutely free. There you go. Got it out of the way. Alrighty. And we are going to be doing Heaven Sword as was mentioned, so thank you all so much for the bid war. That means we are going to get into it, but before that, I have a co-commentator that is going to help me out. Introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm K-Man. I'm going to be here commentating for the run.
Alrighty, so the way that this is going to work, if you've never seen an All Dungeons run before, is we're going to be using the unrestricted party option in the Duty Finder that is going to allow us to enter older content like Heaven Sword at max level with all the items, abilities, and other stuff like, abilities, gear, all the stuff that we would normally have at the maximum level in these older pieces of content. So we're going to go ahead, pop a couple pieces of food to increase our stats, and the timing of this run will begin when the barrier that is the load barrier inside the first dungeon is down. So I will let you know when that is ready to go, and here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your donations. Let's rock. So I'm going to get right into it and let K-Man explain how Ninja works as we wait for the barrier to drop, and timing begins now.
All right, so if you've not played Final Fantasy before, it's a somewhat traditional MMO, and this is the DPS job Ninja. You'll see right off the gate, there's going to be a little bit of flashing symbols. That's going to happen a fair bit throughout the run. That is Ninja's main gimmick and for these runs, called mudras, where you have 3 different mudra abilities, and you can press them in any order of 1, 2, or 3 mudras, and you'll get a different ability to use off of it. And the 2 main ones you'll be seeing over and over again are Raiton and what's the fireball fluff? I don't remember.
Katon.
That one. Raiton, what's so great about it is every time you use it, you get a little dash just like that. And you can hold up to 3 of those. So every time you cast Raiton, one of those right there, those big lightning bolts, then you get a free dash to an enemy. But on top of that, Ninja has another dash called Sakuchi, and this one is just ground targeted. Doesn't have to be targeting an enemy. He can go anywhere they want. And that is also refreshed every time they use a mudra. So you just get an absolute insane amount of movement from all of these different abilities that just, on top of Ninja, just naturally moves faster. It just moves just a little bit faster than every other job in the entire game. So it really just makes Ninja an absolute mobile powerhouse. Which means as long as you can survive what you're doing, which in much older content like this is not a problem whatsoever, Ninja is just the absolute king of speed.
Yeah. So as K-Man mentioned, there's a passive run speed buff that Ninja has as well. That run speed buff is not very big. It's only about a 3 to 5% buff in the grand scheme of things. However, that buff adds up over time because dungeon design in Final Fantasy XIV is very much a point A to point B type of romp. So because of that, every little bit of time that you are spending running, that time save that comes from that extra movement speed adds up and adds up and adds up and can lead to a full-on minute plus over the course of the entire run, more or less. And that's, again, on top of all the other ridiculous movement capabilities that Ninja has as a job. You have the all-class ability Sprint, which just increases your movement speed by 30%. And that's something that every job has, but it's something that we make use of on top of all the other tools that we have in our arsenal as a ninja. So, we've gone through and explained why Ninja is so fast, and we're basically already at the end of this dungeon. with that being said. But one of the other reasons that makes Ninja so good for these is the fact that it excels at dealing burst damage. So, especially for killing the bosses in the Heavensward expansion, you want to be using your highest burst damage abilities as much as you can on the bosses, simply because they have like way more health than just your typical mobs type of deal. And to accentuate to help with that, we have the single highest damaging ability in the entire game, which is Hyosho Ranryu, which is an ability that gets unlocked via the use of Kasatsu, that has a base potency of 1,300 that gets increased by 30% because of the passive effect of Kasatsu as a buff. So that ability, especially when it gets a direct hit crit, which is both, if you don't, it's basically you treat a direct hit as a flat 25% damage increase, and then a crit like your typical RPG critical hit type of deal. You can just absolutely shred bosses. Like, even when we get to the later part of the expansion, where the health and the scaling, because of the way the game is designed, gets higher and higher, and bosses take more and more hits to die, Hyosho Ranryu can either completely one-shot these bosses or take like 90% of its health pool in a single blow. So that is a super important ability to make sure that you're using it at the correct times. Now, I am going to go ahead and hand it over to the host for any messages we do have, as this section of this dungeon here, Samal, is unfortunately a bit of an auto-scroller, so there's not much I can do to speed it up. So take it away.
Well, we just had a big part open for Chained Echoes for either what can watch turtle races or what color sky armor to use. And of course, our gator skin bid war, which Chonky Boy in a very comfortable lead. So I'm going to check if we have any donations real quick. None yet, but there are plenty of incentives. We have a lot of prizes, a lot of bid wars going on, and just a lot of great runs coming up later. We already met our first one for our bonus game, Viewfinder. We got a lot more coming up.
Viewfinder is a very, very good run. Good job for all of you on hitting that. You will not be disappointed if you've never seen a Viewfinder run before. All right, so this section of the auto-scroller, because I do have to just kind of wait here for the Ice Dragon here to shoot 4 of these Ice Pillars, what I'm doing here is I'm actually stacking up 3 charges of my Raiju ready. And the reason I am doing this is because this will give me a massive amount of mobility in this section coming up here. Because on top of being able to use my ground targeted Shikuchi dashes, I will also be able to use these Raitons in the following section to speed through by dashing to a target, then using a Shikuchi, and dashing to a target, using Shikuchi. And that is going to save a lot of time by taking the time to set up the speed through this section here. But something to note about Final Fantasy XIV's dungeon design as a whole is, especially in the Heavensward area, but like pretty much solidified by the end of the Heavensward era, is dungeon design tends to be very linear, and also the ways in which you progress through the dungeons tend to be almost pretty consistent. With very few exceptions, the way that dungeon design works is there is a set number of mobs in a section between bosses that you have to kill, and killing all of the mobs will then make the barrier that's preventing you from progressing the dungeon drop, at which point you progress further in the dungeon, and you repeat the cycle till you reach a boss. So even if my goal is going fast and using enemies to maximize the speed in which I am killing enemies, I do also want to make sure that I'm killing all the enemies efficiently as well, to not lose any time to like a missed enemy that is holding me back from progressing through the dungeon. So that is the second dungeon down, and we're speeding through things right away. I can get K-Man to go over real quick the notable downside of Ninja in these speedruns that can be a little bit difficult depending on the situation. And that's AoE, by the way.
Okay, I was honestly not 100% sure what you were implying. But, yes. Unfortunately, as Fluffy said, the vast majority of the time spent in these dungeons is killing each individual enemy. Ninja has one of, if not the worst AoE capabilities as far as melee DPS goes. As of right now, you're seeing that's not really all that much of an issue, and frankly, by the end of Heaven's Word, it's still not that much of an issue. But while everything individually is just being one-shot by all of Fluffy's ranged abilities and getting dashes, if there is, like, whenever there is any sort of extended AoE portions, Ninja typically does them much slowly. But even with all that, in later expansions, like the Beginnings of Endwalker, Ninja still blows other jobs out of the water, not only because of its movement, but because, as Fluffy previously mentioned, Yosho Ranryu, it's just such a massive amount of damage in a single ability that Ninja's Burst still makes incredibly short work of bosses, even at much closer to current level expansions.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that AoE weakness doesn't ultimately come into play during the course of these runs, but it is something to take into account when you're doing some of the later expansions, for sure. With that being said, the overall structure of dungeon designs in 14 is very much staggered in terms of combat. Like, there's going to be at least a bit of time, like right here, for example, where you are just not doing any combat whatsoever. And because of the fact that Ninja's main source of DPS is very heavily burst, it means that Ninja benefits in these type of environments more than other jobs do because of that. So every single time there's a long period of time that's staggered is time that my cooldowns are coming back. It's time that I have the capability to get more not so much get more resources in the sense of, like, you know, cooldowns for dashes, but get more resources for dealing damage type of deal. And that, again, stacks up on top of the already significant amount of advantages that Ninja has in a speedrunning setting. And that has only gotten better over time as more and more burst tools have been added to Ninja as a whole. But I may have mentioned earlier how dungeon design tends to be very similar in how you progress through, but that's not always the case. As I said, sometimes the progression is killing everything in an area. Sometimes it's only killing specific things. So as you can see in the left side of the screen, the aggro list tells me that there's a bunch of enemies still aggro to me. However, I only need to kill specific enemies in that section in order to make the path to the final boss available, at which point I just destroy it immediately. And for the record, the game considers a dungeon to be finished when the final boss of that dungeon is dead. So even if there were enemies still chasing me in that situation, I don't have to actually care about them. The game considers the dungeon finished, therefore I'm allowed to leave. Alright, so this dungeon is the Vault, and I'm not going to say anything, but if you know, you know. So this dungeon actually received some changes over the course of this expansion, along with several other dungeons, in an attempt to make the game more appealing to a single-player perspective. This dungeon used to have these ad spawns come from the various gates and various nooks and crannies of this first section. But when they changed the dungeon around to be more fitting from a solo player experience, these ads were thankfully put in a much more advantageous situation where I can just take them out immediately and don't have to wait for them to gather up. So it actually does make the first section of the vault here a little bit faster. And there are a significant amount of changes that have been made to dungeons, where certain things that used to be one way are now a different way. Some positive, some negative, but as a whole, this is one of the main reasons why Final Fantasy XIV speedrunning continues to be fun for me over time, is as the game evolves, as the game changes, so do the strats, so too do the structure of certain things that constantly keeps the speed run fresh, and that applies for all the different categories: The Realm Reborn, Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers. It's a very fun time as a whole. All right, so we're gonna head into the second section of this section of the vault here, and we're coming up on a boss that does have a little bit of an annoying factor to it. So certain bosses, they have what's known as a hard lock, where you cannot kill them until a specific thing ends, and this boss is one of them. So we cut him down to about 50% HP, and he goes into a transformation sequence. But the moment that he spawns in, he immediately casts to Dimensional Collapse. And unfortunately, the boss will not enter a death state until that animation is done. So we just have to make sure that the boss is dead prior to that. Rather, the boss is at 0.1% HP prior to that animation ending if we want to make sure that we progress. But at this point, it's very easy to do so. So it just ends up being a little bit of time that you just have to, unfortunately, sit there and wait for. But the next boss has something more crucial to pay attention to. And K-Man can go into what that is and why it is important.
So, the boss of the last dungeon actually also had something like this, but was very easy to just one-shot and get it out of the way. But a few bosses across this run will have ad phases, where the boss is going to go untargetable, and you're going to have to do something to make him come back. And the notable way to skip a lot of these, aside from just straight up one-shotting the boss, is waiting for certain things to happen, where the boss can either get stuck in a cast bar or stuck doing a certain animation. Typically, it just requires a little bit of patience, where you just sit there and kind of have to do nothing, but it ends up saving, maybe 2-3 minutes, because you have to go through this whole long sequence of killing all these enemies and then watching the boss do its big special ultimate attack that deals no damage anyway.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
I was gonna finish up and say the last boss of the vault there that I just took out with a setup to make sure that he would not go into his ad phase, but also die to the Hyoshio Ranryu that I threw out. That boss, if he does his ad phase, loses me about 40 seconds if he goes into that ad phase, which for the nature of 14 speedruns is actually a very significant amount of time to lose. Yeah, so the second boss of this dungeon here, the Great Gooball Library, is also another boss that has ad phases to it. So we're going to want to do a specific setup for it to try and make it at the right HP threshold, where even if Hyoshio Ranryu doesn't one-shot it, even if Hyoshio Ranryu wouldn't one-shot it at full HP, it'll guaranteed one-shot it at an HP threshold that is neither too high to not have Hyoshio one-shot it, but also not too low so that the boss goes into the ad phase in question.
Ah, yes, and that's something I didn't mention. For the vast majority of bosses and everything you'll see in this run, when a boss goes into its ad phase is entirely determined on how much health it has. And actually, before the previously mentioned reworks that some of the dungeons in this run received, some of the bosses would just force out their ad phase anyway, and there'd be no possible way to skip it. As Fluffy previously mentioned, they would hard lock, then do the ad phase, then it would finally be over.
Yeah. So, as I said, certain changes were positive, certain changes were negative for the speedrun, but it is a constantly changing thing, and learning and adapting to these new changes is something I think is very fun when they do come along, because it does keep the run fresh in a way that is different from, a new sequence break got discovered. Oh, what's the crazy new thing that's going to happen for the speed run today type of deal, where a lot of the changes come out from developer changes to the game as a whole. And that is the nature of MMOs. The nature of MMOs is that they are effectively live service games. They constantly change over time. And in this case, it has been a mixed bag, but an interesting mixed bag. And that's the key thing to know.
Yeah.
All right.
And who knows, maybe with the next expansion, the new melee job Viper, that seems to be a little more of a tricksy mobile kind of DPS like Ninja. Maybe in a year and a half come then, we'll have a new job everything's ran on. Who knows?
Alrighty. That is the Great Goo Ball Library down. Next up is the Ethereal Chemical Research Facility, commonly referred to as ARF. Why am I bringing that up? You tell me. Why am I bringing that up? Anyway, so the start of this dungeon, just to explain like the thought process that goes into sort of how I go through like deciding how I want to deal with any given situation, is I consider mostly that I want to have Rhytons. I want to use Rhytons for Forked Raijus to have extra dashes if I can manage it. However, there are situations where that's not always applicable for one reason or another. Oop, accidental misinput there. Gonna have to do an adaptation. So for this first section, I actually use Catons almost exclusively because I don't get much benefit from having Rhytons available to me right at the start of this dungeon, in the same way that I get benefit from Catons being able to deal a bunch of AoE damage to the mobs in question. So, for that first section, Caton reigns supreme for the AoE cleave, and the fact that ARF loves to put barriers in your way with very small amounts of mobs versus normal dungeon design where you're expected to pull, you can pull up to 2, maybe 3 sets of mobs before you reach the wall that's stopping you from progressing. But now that we're into the second section here, I'm going to take a little bit of time to... I need to make sure this guy dies before I do this. I'm going to take a little bit of time to actually build up a tiny amount of resource on this. So I'm going to try and pull everything together best I can. I used this a little early, so I'm going to have to adapt here, which is no big deal. Adaptation is definitely a big part of running this run as well, because sometimes, based on your damage numbers, you will get through a section quicker than you would otherwise because you killed things like 3 or 4 GCDs earlier type of deal, and you'll have to adapt because your cooldowns won't be up at the same time. So we just treat it like that. We treat mistakes as just a way of, you know, honing your adaptation skills for the sake of this run. That is something that is worth going into, is GCDs and how every GCD you cast can affect the length of a run, if you want to go into that, K-Man.
Yeah, so if you've never played an MMO before, a lot of the more traditional ones, they have a system called GCD, which is short for Global Cooldown, where like you'll have, like, depending on the game, like 5 to 15 different abilities that all share the same global cooldown that is usually relatively short, and those are your abilities that you use just constantly. You just want to keep that global cooldown rolling, and that's how you end up pushing out the most DPS. And in this game, the baseline, the absolute slowest the global cooldown can be is 2.5 seconds. But one more small reason Ninja's great. Ninja gets its own personal buff that boosts its attack speed, so a Ninja's global cooldown is much closer to 2 seconds flat than 2.5. But as Fluffy said, mistakes happen. Sometimes you don't get quite every enemy you want in a GCD in an attack. Sometimes they survive with barely any health like that due to the relatively limited RNG you have in damage values in this game. So for every extra global cooldown you have to use because of any mistakes or any unluckiness, that's just straight up an extra 2 seconds. One thing that can mitigate that, and what Ninja actually has a lot of, and it's yet another small part of what makes it good, is ranged attack. If you have a ranged attack, especially a high damaging one like Rhyton, that mitigates a lot of it because, oh, that one guy didn't die? That's alright. I can keep moving and throw a ranged attack backwards at him. I don't have to stop and kill him myself, or kill him at melee with a global cooldown. So that's why throughout most of this run, you won't see that matter a ton except on bosses. But even some of them, as you see, Fluffy just walks right by them. You don't even see him slow down at all.
Alright, so this is the final boss of Arf, and this used to be a very different encounter. Previously, you used to only fight one of these bosses at a time, and you had to get them to 50% and 40% respectively to make it go into this phase here, which was a boss that you used to be able to 3-shot because of its total health pool. However, the way that they changed it, this boss will actually hard lock at 0.1%, and I can't do anything about that. So all I can do is make the boss get to 0.1% as fast as possible, and then finish this ad phase as quickly as I can, which I save a Kyoshi Ramyu for, to immediately destroy the ad sphere, make it end its ad phase as soon as possible, at which point all we have to do is hit one more GCD when Ascian Prime here becomes available, at which point the dungeon will end and we can continue it. Alright. So that is the end of the leveling dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV, all done and done. And now we go to Neverreap.
I do have a couple donations if we have some time.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, first up, we have Io with $25. No comment, but thank you for your donation regardless. And we have Nathan Lucario giving us $5 to the Gatorskin Bid War. They say, name that ninja. Guess correctly and I'll donate 5 gil to the incentive of your choice. Which FF ninja said this quote? You think our anger a weakness? Then let me show you how wrong you are. Thank you for your donation, Nathan.
I don't know which one that could be. Because there's a lot of FF ninjas. And that is not... My brain wants to say Yagiri, but I also don't think that's the correct answer there either. I don't think Yagiri said that before.
I'm gonna guess Yuffie because she's the only other Final Fantasy ninja I know.
Alright, well, either way, we're continuing on in Neverreap, and this is one of those dungeons that does actually have a unique way of progressing through that isn't quite the same as you'd expect. So at the start of the dungeon, we pick up eggs that we have to put in these altars in order to progress through the dungeon. And there's also an additional thing where during this section here, there's only specific enemies actually have to die in order to continue through. So mainly through here, as I'm going to be targeting those enemies in specific. Ooh. So that is a bit of an unfortunate situation. The giant hitbox of the tree stole my targeting, at which point I targeted the wrong enemy with that dash, which meant I had to improvise. But that's okay, because improvising is part of the job. But yeah, there's a lot of things that can potentially go wrong in any particular dungeon. And as I said, learning how to adapt to those situations and making sure that you're continuously moving as much as you possibly can, you minimize your GCDs as much as you possibly can, is integral to this. Something we haven't mentioned, though, I don't think of it. Did we mention Hyde yet, K-Man?
Nope.
Yeah.
I totally forgot about that a little bit.
Yeah, so Hide is an ability that Ninja has, and what Hide does is it makes you invisible, quote-unquote, until you deactivate the ability. But the main thing that you actually use Hide for is Hide actually resets the cooldowns of your mudras. Hide can only be used out of combat, so it's not something that you can just constantly use at all times. But anytime that you can use Hide, you're getting more mudras, which can potentially mean more Shikuchis, more Raijus, more mobility, more speed, and that's something that you want to be looking for at all times. But you don't always get access to that, and sometimes you'll run through a section and you'll be unable to kill the ads that are behind you, and that'll be preventing you from progressing forward, since you can't ultimately take advantage of the hides, the resetting of your cooldowns. But sometimes that is the faster choice, because sitting there and taking the time to take out those enemies would be slower overall. Like, you'd lose 10 seconds to GCDs rather than just continuing forward when they're not like a mandatory enemy to kill. So an important factor in making sure you are going as fast as possible is knowing what you do and do not have to do in these dungeons. So for example, in this section of the dungeon that we're currently in, which is the Fractal Continuum, I have to make sure that every enemy that exists in this section dies in order to open up the door. But there'll be a section later where I only have to actually care about specific enemies at specific times if I want to progress through the dungeon. A little bit of low damage rolls there, unfortunately. Have to spend a couple extra GCDs, but not the end of the world. You may notice, if you're familiar with 14, that I'm not really activating Huton, which is the ability that speeds up my GC and makes me attack faster, very often. And that's mostly because that does cost a Mudra charge. And generally speaking, it's almost generally more efficient throughout the majority of the Heavensward run to spend your Mudras on mobility than it is to spend it on making sure your GCD goes faster. But as I mentioned, this section of the dungeon is different in the sense that I can actually fully ignore the enemies that spawn in that first chamber to come over and kill these three, which spawn the additional enemies that exist on the top of these little... What are those? Those are chambers, like... What is it? Stasis chambers.
I call them a stasis chamber.
Yeah.
So considering where we are in lore, a jail cell might be a more apt name.
True. Funny haha lore. The Alligans imprisoned a lot of things because they weren't good people. Anyway. So yeah, that section, you just run through, you ignore the ads that spawn, with the purpose of making other ads that you need to spawn by killing specific enemies spawn, so that you can then kill everything and progress forward in the dungeon. And what it comes down to is not every dungeon's progression will be the same. So having the memorization of being able to remember, okay, this dungeon I need to go here, that dungeon I need to do this, will be a crucial part in making sure that your progression does not get halted by a quick, wait, what did I do? Moment type of deal. So memorization, another tool that you do have to take advantage of during this run. All right. So this section of the Fractal Continuum, ooh, I rabbited. Okay, that's something we can talk about. I was hoping that wouldn't happen, but want to go over a rabbit came in?
Sure. So, one of the most unfortunate, I'll call it user errors that can happen with Ninja is for their mudras, they have a little bit of a strict guideline you have to follow. You will only get a mudra ability if you do not use any duplicates, and if you use 1, 2, or 3. So if you accidentally use press the buttons any extra times, or if you accidentally press one button a couple times in a row, you'll get what the community will call rabbiting, where you'll fail, you'll get a funny noise, and a little rabbit will appear on top of your head. And you'll do absolutely no damage, gain no benefit, and you'll be sad.
Yeah. The benefit is you get to see a bunny on your head. And I'm sure many people watching would be very happy about that part. However, I care about big deeps, so I'm a little bit annoyed when I see the bunny. Alrighty. There's something I thought of in the middle of you saying that, and now I don't remember what it was. Whoopsie daisies. Alright, so speaking of progression stuff, in this dungeon, to take down this first wall, the only thing that has to actually die is those blooming orchids. You can theoretically ignore the rest of those enemies as you progress through here. Next up, same thing here. Take out these Corpicers, which is still one of my favorite enemy names to ever say in forever. And that will cause the next section of the dungeon to pop up. And from here, there's going to be an actually pretty unique section here that was actually the speedrun strats for this dungeon back when this dungeon was even current content. You know, we're talking all the way back in 2016. Lord, I've been playing this game a long time. Anyway, so for this section of the dungeon, the progression is halted by these honeycombs. Now, normally, you know, progression, you have to take out specific enemies or all the enemies, but in this particular case, you can actually completely ignore every enemy in this area if you wanted to. All you have to do is take out the honeycombs, and once the honeycombs are down, you can just keep running directly into the boss room, and all those enemies that are chasing me are stuck up there, and there's nothing they can do about it. It's great. And that was the speedrun strat that you used to do for this dungeon back in the day as well, when this was like a current content dungeon. So it's very nice that something that applied, like, you know, back in 2016 still applies like in 2023 for running this game. And I think that's neat. All right, the final section of this dungeon, though, is just a section where we do have to make sure that every enemy is taken out. One of them lived with a little bit of HP. And one of those things that K-Man mentioned that can just happen sometimes. I have to shoot. Yeah, I'll just use future charges. So we're going to get up to the end part of this dungeon here, specifically target the Royal Oak with this. Now we're going to set up in front of the barrier towards the final boss. Going to set up a Doton, which is a ground puddle that we put on the ground that does damage over time to any enemies that are in it. That will assist us in making sure the enemies that we want to kill, which is everything, die as soon as it possibly can, and is pretty much the only way that Ninja's AoE can stop from being just completely mediocre the whole way through. But ultimately, you won't see us rely on Doton too much throughout the course of this run. All right. So that was St. Mocaine's the Arboretum. It's the Arboretum. And now we move on to Pharaoh's Serious Heart. And this has a funny little thing in it as we get to the first boss, which is a niche movement thing that we don't get to take advantage of very often, but applies to basically every dash ability in the game. Is very silly, but is just the way that Final Fantasy XIV is coded. So, in the meantime, though, we do have to make sure that every enemy through this section is taken out. So that is going to be the goal here. Alright, so, I'm going to dash off this ledge, and you'll notice I teleported immediately to the ground. So, the way that dashes work in 14 is that even if the dash is considered like a teleport, or if the dash is considered, you know, a jump, the game doesn't actually consider the flavor of what the thing is in question. It is just the dashes in this game are coded in the sense that they just move you along the ground. So if you move from high ground to low ground, and at any point, you know, fall off of something, the game will simply teleport you to the ground at the coordinates you're currently at. Which means if you dash over top of a hole, you will just simply teleport to the bottom of that hole, which saves all the falling time in the dungeon, and does actually save time in a few places. It is very silly, and pretty much a holdover from the fact that this game was rebuilt from its 1.0 version, which is its own story. I highly recommend looking into, I believe it's the Speakers Network, their documentary on Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, because it's a very interesting story there. But yeah, that's one of those things that's just inevitably a holdover from the 1.0 version of the game and the way things are coded. Because fun fact, you didn't have the ability to jump in the 1.0 version of the game. It's very silly, I know. But yeah, so here we go, and we're now in the final section of this dungeon, and it's going to be very weird. So the first section is going to be taking out the incubator and this pickman. And then we have a weird moment where I'm going to ignore these ads, or at the very least, not go out of my way to kill them, because I have to come over here and take out these bomb incubators. But in the meantime, I'm going to make sure to aggro these two enemies so that they stop hitting that wall. And then once these bomb incubators are all destroyed, then the enemies are going to all end up over where I am, and then they're all dead. And that sequence of events is the fastest I've been able to go through this section every time I test it. And I would beg somebody to try and find a faster way through that section is all I'm going to say. Alright, so this is a slightly unique boss for this speedrun in the sense that it's not something I just one-shot and then move on from. I do have to kill a first boss and then do an ad phase and then kill a second boss. So I actually generally want to save my cooldowns in a specific way that my enemy killing nature is efficient, and I'm using as few cooldowns as possible, or GCDs as possible, rather. And we can take out the second boss in 2 GCDs, and we're done and dusted. And now we move on to the next dungeon, which was the Anti-Tower. And the Anti-Tower, oh boy. So the first section of an Anti-Tower, every single wall that you run into, you have to kill all the enemies to make the wall disappear. However, most of the ads don't spawn until aggro is established on the first enemy that's there. So it's not possible to do things where you just, use a Katon that hits all the enemies and then you move forward with your life. No, you have to purposefully hit one target and then spawn the other two and kill those two targets in a way that's efficient. But sometimes, your RNG doesn't work out, and you have to adapt even more to something that's very silly. And I don't like the first section of this dungeon. I wish it was more consistent. But it has to spite me by not being. Anyway, what's your favorite dungeon in this expansion, K-Man?
In this expansion? God, you're gonna have to make me remember the name, which I can't. The one where we fight Hraesvelgar at the end.
Oh.
Back before they changed that fight.
Sorkai, yeah, Sorkai.
Yeah, one Sorkai. Sorkai's sick.
Yeah, Sorkai's really good. I like Sorkai a lot. And we will get to there pretty soon in the case of this run, actually. That is also something that we can go over. So, as K-Man mentioned, the ending boss of that dungeon is Hraesvelgar, and that fight was actually changed. So we've mentioned a couple times now that these dungeons have gone through changes from their original versions. And K-Man, you want to explain the main reason why these changes occurred?
Sure. As Fluffy mentioned earlier, they've made a lot of changes to Final Fantasy XIV to try and make it more appealing to single-player players who just want to play this game as a story game and aren't super keen on all the grindiness and all the other wonderful things that come with an MMO. So over the course of the past almost 4 years, I guess at this point, they've been working on a system they call the Trust System, where instead of queuing for a dungeon and going into it with 3 other players who you may or may not know, you instead go in with NPCs. Your familiar friendly faces from the story, or sometimes just some generic guys that are themed to the area you're in at the time in the story. But what that has caused is a simplification of some things that were otherwise very unique and different, because I presume because it would have been difficult to get AI to properly do some of those fights. But and that's actually also a common thread throughout Heavensward, where you'll notice some dungeons do have like different things where, oh, you don't just need to kill everything, you need to kill those boilers like in the last dungeon, or you'll otherwise have to kill specific enemies or do different unique things. A lot of that kind of stuff also got removed with the dungeon reworks to accommodate the trust system. So it's a general theme of, if you see those kind of different unique things in the dungeons, it's pretty safe to assume that's the original dungeon as it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is most notable in the A Realm Reborn speedrun, where the Realm Reborn had very, very different dungeon design at the time, where progression through it wasn't as standardized as it is now. You had all different manner of progressing through dungeons. Some dungeons were somewhat non-linear compared to how they are now. Some dungeons were just absolute messes, like the 1,000 Maws of Tota Rock. But yeah, speaking of, but then like you do the run now, and you have these varying dungeons of, here's this dungeon where I can literally ignore everything, and then here's this dungeon where I have to kill literally everything, and it's very, very varied because of that, because of all the changes that have been made to the game over time. All right, so now we're in the Lost City of Amdapor hard, and this second section here actually takes a bit of knowledge to optimize. So the intended way that you're supposed to deal with this is you're supposed to drag these enemies into the light to make them more vulnerable to everything. However, we can one-shot everything anyway, so dragging them into the light is not the biggest deal. But you have to also deal with like multiple different annoyances in this section, like right here, where you have to kill all those enemies to spawn. But there's a roaming ad that doesn't like to sit still, and if that ad is in the wrong spot, he will be out of your AoE that you want to cast, and he won't stay still. So again, adapting to the way that things work out through that section is important to make sure that everything goes smoothly in the future. My train of thought has completely derailed as I'm trying to like play the game, press all my buttons, and then also explain my thoughts in the process. That is how marathon commentary works, everybody. Anyway, this final section is there's going to be these light sprites. Sometimes they're roaming, sometimes they like to go all the way down there, completely away from everyone and everything. And that's their choice, more power to them for doing that. However, you do need to kill them all. So killing the light sprites first, and then using the resources that you gain from doing so to kill the remaining enemies in this area as quickly as possible is integral to speed through this last section. And now we're coming up on a fairly unique boss in the grand scheme of things. That's going to be handled a little bit differently from how I typically have been handling bosses, where I throw all my burst into it and I want it to die as soon as possible. I'm actually going to avoid using my stronger burst right at the start. And this is because this boss has a buff that causes it to respawn twice. So, the end goal is to use my weaker burst stuff first, kill it, use some a bit stronger burst stuff second, and then use my absolute strongest burst on the third one. And yeah, as you can see, Kyoshi Ranryu did the trick immediately and murderized it completely. And I love that. I love Kyoshi Ranryu. I love being able to see big number. All right, and now we're heading on into Sor Kai, and this is the dungeon that K-Man talked about with, having had the final boss change in a way, but also the progression through this dungeon is very fun. The way that the enemies are laid out here is in very fun ways for making use of your movement the whole way through. While you do have to technically kill everything throughout this section, Train of thought derailed. Well, you do have to kill everything through this section. The way to do it optimally just sort of incidentally kills everything along the way. So it's not actually like super bad at all for even like making mistakes through the section. You will generally just sort of incidentally kill everything as you run through it. The second section is also unique in the sense that, again, where a lot of dungeons expect you to kill everything, the second section actually expects two different things for progression. The first thing is it wants you to kill all of these Sorkai eggs. Once all of these eggs are dead, the wall comes down and is broken by this Anzu, at which point, the only enemies that we have to kill to make the jump to the next boss appear is to kill the final three enemies in this section of the dungeon. So, we're going to do just that, take them out. As you can see, this gust of wind has now appeared in front of us. We're going to ride this and head on over to the second boss. Ideally, this dies immediately. If it doesn't, that's no big deal. We had a backup, but 253,000 damage. I love me Hyosho Ranryu, and I love the big number that it bring out.
I love those critical hits.
Yeah, so I went over it a little bit earlier because I was trying to get to a different point at the time. But damage variance, there's an inherent amount of damage variance where nothing will deal the exact same damage every single time. This is typical for JRPG damage dealing. But then there's also critical hits and direct hits. As I mentioned, direct hits are a 25% damage buff that is just flat whenever you do get a direct hit. And critical hits are varied in the sense that they deal more damage than a direct hit, but the amount of damage that you deal and your ability and how often you deal critical hit is tied to your critical hit substat that you get from gearing among foods and buffs and other things. And Kanan can go into why the critical hit stat is just sort of ridiculous in this game.
Yeah, so it is absolutely ridiculous. It is the only substat in the entire game that doesn't stack linearly, or worse, it stacks exponentially. So the more of it you get, the better it is. And that's because, unlike direct hit, where it is always a flat damage buff, but the more direct hit you have, the more you get, crit not only happens more often the more you have, it also deals more damage the more you have. And because of that, like, double action effect, it, in most cases, I can't say all, because that would be wrong, but in the vast majority of the cases, that just overshadows everything else. It is a very large part of damage variance when you're trying to, like, absolutely maximize the amount of damage you're dealing in, like, high-end content. Which can be a sore spot for some people.
I actually do have a couple donations to read if I can cut in for a quick minute.
Yeah, this is an auto-scroller boss, so take it away.
All right, cool. So we have Alubersto for $5 who says, don't remember if mentioned, every Raiten, Katzen, and Hyoten grants 1 stack of Shukuichi. Even more mobility. Thank you for your donation. I have no point of reference for what they just said, but sure. But regardless, thank you very much for your donation. And we have $5 from JD Puppy, who says, slowly but surely, these turtles will make it to the finish, donating $5 for a turtle train. Thank you very much for your donation. And yes, that is one of our bid incentives coming up for Moonblaze Wolf's Chained Echoes run. If we make it to $200 in that particular incentive, we get to watch the turtle races. I'm going to think it's a lot like the Chow races in Sonic Adventure 2, and it's just hype as hell. We also got a couple other bid wars going on, namely Skater Gator 3D for their skin, what skin they're going to use, and Sky Armor Color bid war. That's also for Moonblaze Wolf's Chained Echo speedrun coming in just a couple hours.
Alrighty. Yeah, there's a lot of really good incentives and really good runs this time around, everybody. So please get your donations in if you're ever looking forward to anything in particular. Gator Skater, by the way, you'll love that one. You'll absolutely love that one. I looked into it myself earlier. Mwah, that is just peak. Let me tell you something.
It's only $5 on Steam.
Alrighty.
If that helps anybody, Skater Gator, that's definitely, within impulse buy territory.
Alrighty, so something that isn't necessarily something I've been talking about is something I have been doing. So as mentioned earlier, Ninja's passive move speed buff does give it a little bit of an edge over the other jobs in the sense that over time, as you're running from point A to point B, it will gain that advantage slowly but surely. But it's still important, regardless of that, to make sure that you're taking a good line. So, generally speaking, your movement is more important to do. Point A to point B stuff is more important to take advantage of your dash abilities more than anything else when you're progressing through here. However, it is not unreasonable, especially in long situations where you aren't dealing with any enemies, to make sure that you're taking the shortest line possible. And that's just generally a given whenever you're trying to do something, walk from point A to point B as fast as possible. But sometimes the shortest line isn't always as obvious. By the way, this is an auto-scroller boss. Hard locks at 0.1% until this transformation happens. At which point the transformation happens. One more GCD, kills the boss, moves on from there. But sometimes it's not always obvious what is the best line, because sometimes there are pieces of terrain that don't look passable that you can actually just jump over. In other cases, like right here in the start of this dungeon, Zelfatol, something that looks walkable ends up not being walkable because a giant boulder drops in front of your face. And the hitbox for that boulder is always there, even if it's not physically there. So, sometimes you're just walking and then you stop and you're wondering why, and it's because boulder. So, again, going back into the memorization thing of, remembering your tight lines, remembering going through everything as fast as possible, and taking even the smallest things, which is just, taking a line that saves 1 second. Every time you do that, it adds up over time. It makes your run go by just that much faster. Accidentally did that a little early. So, something you can do, again, it's another niche little movement option that comes from movement abilities like Shikuchi, is sometimes when you're waiting for a barrier that's preventing you from moving forward, sometime when you're waiting for that barrier to drop, you can actually use a dash, either like Shikuchi, or if there's a target that you can do behind it, you use a Raiju. You can dash towards that location, and then the moment that the game says, okay, yes, you can move through here now, the game is always trying to complete the dash from point A to point B. It will stop you if it can't reach that point. However, if it now says that you can reach that point and you are way far back, you'll actually just teleport forward. It's hard to show off because there's not a whole lot of places where the barriers preventing you from moving forward stick around for long enough for it to be super noticeable. But it's one of those things where if you can remember that it's a thing and take advantage of it. I tried to do it there because there's gates on that elevator that can open. If you can take advantage of them, it's just a little bit of extra time save that you can save here and there.
Well, the other things that can also be a small time save in this run are auto attacks. Something that can very easily when you have all these other abilities that you're using. But auto attacks, especially at lower levels like these, can do as much or even more sometimes if you get a crit damage than one of your global cooldowns. And especially in AoE situations where you'll have one enemy that has like a lot more HP than the rest, if you make sure you're auto attacking that enemy, everything just dies all at the same time and you don't have to spend any extra time. But something along that line comes in more in the runs that are closer to current content than Heaven's Word.
Yeah, you'll definitely be seeing auto attacks be taken more advantage of in Stormblood and especially in Shadowbringers all dungeon runs than you do Heaven's Sword. But it is still definitely worth talking about because there are some locations where auto attacks are important in the context of the Heaven's Sword run, for sure. Speaking of dungeon changes that we've talked about over time, this is one of these cases where the dungeon changes ends up being negative overall for the speedrun, because previously, the way that this dungeon worked is you used to just be able to destroy these balloons and prevent the adds that were inside them from spawning entirely, which sped the section up. However, you do now have to actually wait for the adds themselves to spawn, which does unfortunately make this section a little bit slower than how it used to be. Not super slower, but one of those changes that was unfortunately, you know, negative for the speed of this dungeon. But not the end of the world, as we will progress onward to the final boss here, who is notoriously tanky. This guy loves to just eat my GCDs and just, I don't know why, but Tozal, you just love to exist for longer than you should, and I don't agree with that. Come on, you need to be faster. All right, so we have 3 dungeons left in this run. We're going to be done with it fairly quickly here as we progress forward. Next up is the Great Gubal Library Hard, which is my personal favorite dungeon from the speedrunning perspective, and also part of the best expert roulette this game has ever had. Don't at me.
Yep, and in Final Fantasy XIV, the hard at the end of it, it's not actually harder. What they really just use that for is it's the same location and same aesthetics as an older dungeon, but it's a little different. Like in the case of this one, you're kind of going a little bit backwards and taking a little bit of a different direction in the dungeon than you did the first time.
A little bit unfortunate with the damage numbers in this dungeon. Some enemies living longer than they should. That's damage variance to it. You can't ultimately control it. You can only really adapt to it as time goes on. But yeah, we are going to be taking a detour from how we used to. Well, the first part of it, we take the same path. As we get to the second section here, instead of taking a left or a right, we're going to go the other way. I don't remember which is which at this point, but I do know that we just go the different way.
I do have a donation from Timberwolf Trading, one of our beloved sponsors here at Fastest Furs Fall Fest 2023. Timberwolf Trading donates $85 and says,
Damn.
It's been a great marathon so far, and we are happy to be partnering with Fastest Furs to offer this year's marathon shirts. Be sure to check out the designs and get yours soon. Ow! Can I get some ows in chat?
I'll give you one. I'll do it. Why not?
All right, cool. Thank you.
All right. So, something I haven't really talked about a whole lot is what is sprint as an ability. As I said, sprint does increase your movement speed by 30% whenever you use it, and every job in the game does have it. However, there's a couple caveats to sprint as an ability. The first caveat is that sprint has a 20-second duration, but that duration is halved whenever you use sprint in combat. So, generally speaking, anytime you do want to use sprint, you want to use it outside of combat to maximize its effectiveness. Sometimes this doesn't always come up, and you have to take the half effective crit half effective sprint, and that's fine because, you know, sometimes it is faster to do that. But the other caveat to sprint is the fact that there are sometimes in dungeons, as you saw in this one, you enter loading zones to go to a different part of it. And if you activate sprint while entering a loading zone, like any other cooldown that does have, or any other ability that does have a max duration to it, that duration keeps ticking during the loading zone. So very often you want to end up actually using your sprint outside of combat, but also make sure that you're actually getting the full duration of it as a whole, lest you waste like 5 seconds of it on a loading zone. So that is something to keep in mind when taking advantage of sprint when going through dungeons. All right, but that is the Break the Ball library down, and we're now on to the final couple of dungeons here. This is Baelsar's Wall. And Baelsar's Wall, actually, for as late into the expansion as this dungeon came out, it actually has one of the more atypical progressions through it. In both, like, good and bad ways. It's a good way because, like, you know, instead of having to kill everything and then just progressing forward, you kill everything, but you can also pull everything right up to about here, which is way more enemies than you'd usually be able to pull in this situation.
You know, it's kind of funny. I was thinking about it a little bit because this dungeon is a little bit of an aesthetic departure from the rest of the dungeons that you've seen in this entire run. As this one's themed after the Garlean Empire, which is a much more, as you can see, like kind of tech and mecha-oriented empire versus some of the more natural and magical things that you've been seeing thus far. But I feel like for almost all of the Garlean themed dungeons, almost all of them have that kind of, as Fluffy mentioned, the atypical progression through the dungeon. Whereas instead of it's just your normal, you pull everything, you kill it, and then you can move on. I feel like a lot of them have that.
You know, you're kind of right. The MSQ dungeons, especially prior to the reworks as well, used to have that as well. All right, but the second section of Baelsar's Wall is atypical in the sense that it's an entire damn auto-scroller. There's a couple things I can do to speed it up, but these speed ups are at most the difference of about 5 seconds. So if there's any messages, hosts, take it away.
All right, let me just give a quick check. Of course, our lovely, lovely sponsor, Timberwolf Trading, did give us another donation a little while ago. We don't have anything yet, but there are a couple of donation incentives that we still have open. For example, just after midnight, Skater Gator 3D, Chunky Boy, currently in the lead for the skin to be used during that run. We are about 10% of the way there to watch the turtle races in the Chained Echoes speedrun. And we have a 5-way tie for Sky Armor Color Bid War. And of course, that's not the only thing you can donate towards. You can also win one of our many prizes just for donating. I think our grand prize this year is the Nintendo Switch OLED version with a copy of Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Alrighty.
No, Tears of the Kingdom. It's with Tears of the Kingdom, the sequel. Sorry, just wanted to throw that correction in there.
They're the same game. There's nothing fundamentally different about them, I say entirely sarcastically. It's easy to mistake them. It's no biggie. Alrighty, auto-scroller over. Take out the boss. Kill. Destroy. So, a little fun thing I like to point out here. This part of the dungeon, prior, you used to have to step on the elevator, activate the elevator, and then ride the elevator up in order to progress through the dungeon. But that got changed to just entering the load zone, and then you're good. Now, you might think, based on everything I mentioned about how a lot of these dungeons were reworked for the sake of, you know, the trust system, that actually got changed about 2 patches after the dungeon was implemented. And I remember this very clearly because someone tried to gaslight me into remembering otherwise about it. And you're wrong. I know you're wrong. You're never going to be right. Anyway, had to get that out of my system here. This last part of Baelsar's Wall is fairly long in terms of progression through it. So even though a lot of these enemies you'd ideally want to take out a lot of these enemies by killing them with a Katon, it's actually because you can run the full length of this part of the dungeon from the moment you get into it. It's actually going to be more beneficial for you to use your movement abilities the whole way through. Get them all together and then build up. Because of the way that the cooldown ends up working out, you actually end up killing them faster by grouping them all up for one single Katon at the end. Rather than Katoning them in groups and not getting access to the forked Raijus. Anyway, this is the Griffin. This is the source of one of the biggest memes in the community. We don't get to see the meme, unfortunately, because we kill him too fast. It's unfortunate, but such is life. And we are now heading into the final dungeon of the run, which is Some All Hard. So, fun fact, in my current world record run of this, that is still pending on speedrun.com, my gear broke in this dungeon. So I was dealing less damage than I should have, and didn't really realize why. And the reason why is because some of my gear broke, and I didn't have as much stats as I did when I entered the dungeon. So remember to repair your gear, folks. Alrighty. So there's nothing really unique about progression through this dungeon as a whole. It is mostly just kill the enemies to spawn more enemies, and then kill the enemies to break down the wall. But I will take this time to say thank you very much to Fastest Furs for accepting Final Fantasy XIV all dungeons that did end up being Heavensward. I've now ran all dungeons ARR, quote-unquote. Heavensward, Stormblood, and Shadowbringers at marathons now, which I'm very happy to have done. And I do want to say, if you all want to get into speedrunning Final Fantasy XIV, let's say you're like me, you think Endwalker's a little lacking in content, well, make the content for yourself. All dungeon speedruns are very easy to get into because you don't have to, run all the dungeons back to back. You don't even have to do all the dungeons. You could say, hey, that one dungeon was really fun to run, and you could just run that one dungeon. There's leaderboards for every single instance in the game, basically. You want to get the world record on Aurum Vale for some reason? Go get the world record on Aurum Vale, my guy. You can just go and do it, and nobody's going to stop you. I might try and stop you, but actually, Aurum Vale's pretty fun in the unsynced speedrun, so I wouldn't stop you if you were doing that. Yeah, there's a wide variety of ways to speedrun Final Fantasy XIV that isn't just related to all dungeons and unsyncing content. There's MSQ speedruns, where you go through the main story of the game as fast as possible from a fresh, brand new character. There's speedruns of Palace of the Dead, Heaven on High, Eureka Orthos, the deep dungeons, multiple different floors of those as well. There's even a leaderboard for the Kugane Tower jump puzzle now, which, about time, is all I'm going to say on that. But yeah, there's so many ways to take advantage of your love for Final Fantasy XIV and speedrun it however you enjoy to do so. So if it is something that you're interested in, whether it be via my run or whether it be, you've had the thought in the past but never really knew where to start, there's so many places to start. You'll have so much fun with it. But we are now coming up now on the last set of mobs. When these mobs die, the path to the final boss will be open. Once the final boss dies, that will be time. Alright, so get ready on time because it'll be pretty quick. Time. Alrighty. Oop, I tabbed out of the game on accident. Daisies. There we go. Alright, so can I get the final time on that? Because my timer reset in the middle of that, apparently.
I'm seeing 1 hour, 12 minutes, and 36 seconds.
That's world record by 10 seconds. Whoops. That's what happens when your gear is not broken in the final dungeon, everybody. You just save time. Wow. Alrighty.
There's a bunch of GGs in chat, and now we're just getting what? WRs, lots of hype for the run. Thank you so much.
Yeah, all right.
Good job, Fluffy.
All right, so I know the marathon was a bit behind, and even though, we've saved some time here with that run, I am going to go ahead and just get my shout-outs out of the way here so y'all can get back on track. If you all enjoyed the stream, the run, you can find me at twitch.tv/LordFluffy. You can find me at LordFluffyX on Twitter, not calling it X, never doing that. And you can find me at LordFluffy on Blue Sky as well. I do a variety of different speedrun content. I do Titanfall 2. I do Diddy Kong Racing is a passion of mine as of late. I've been loving learning that as of right now. Did Super Mario 64 in the past, Ocarina of Time randomizers. I try and bring a positive vibe into my stream, except for when I'm mad at a speedrun. And I hope you all enjoyed, because this was fun for me to do. Thank you very much again to Fastest First for letting me run the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV with a free trial that includes Oliver Realm Reborn and the award-winning expansion Heaven Sword and Stormblood with no restrictions on playtime. K-Man, you got anything to say?
Nope.
All right. We'll send it out of here then. Thank you very much, and have fun with the rest of the marathon.